Welcome back to AWC in Conversation. I'm Joey Clark, an ecologist and science communicator based in Sydney. My guest today is Dr. Richard Seaton, a senior ecologist on AWC's national science team. Since 2017, Richard has held the role of regional ecologist in the Northeast, overseeing the science program across AWC sanctuaries in Queensland and beyond. Richard has 2 decades of experience working on threatened species conservation projects, and his passion for birds of prey has taken him around the world, from the UK to Mauritius, Madagascar, and New Zealand. He's now involved in a project investigating one of Australia's most elusive birds of prey, the Red Goshawk. Now, I'm afraid we forgot to press record for the first couple of minutes of today's webinar, so at the point where we join this conversation, I had just asked Richard about his lifelong passion for birds of prey, and he was describing a formative experience as a child when he was standing on a Welsh cliff top with his stepfather and watching a peregrine falcon which had just attacked a pigeon.
It was just the most dramatic experience, up on this cliff and this rugged landscape, and just remember these feathers just sort of descending around Robin and I, and just both of us stood there cheering, just like, this is the most amazing thing, I was absolutely captivated from that moment on.
So they're incredibly fast birds, they're hunters, and really from then on it sounds like you've followed raptors around the world. Do you want to talk about one of the early projects that you worked on in the Indian Ocean in Mauritius? Now everyone probably knows that Mauritius is famous for extinction. It was the home of the dodo, perhaps the most famous extinct bird. Do you want to tell us a little about the Mauritius Kestrel? And I'll just share the screen so everyone can see what that bird looks like.
Yeah, well, I was very lucky out of my master's degree to get a paid job out on the island of Mauritius, out in the Indian Ocean. Tiny little island out in the middle of nowhere, in the Mascarenes, with an endemic bird fauna, one of which was the Mauritius Kestrel, which was the world's rarest bird back in the 1970s. And a guy called Carl Jones, very famous guy in the conservation world, decided that he could save this thing. It'd gone down to something like 1 female, a couple of males, or somewhere around that amount. This thing was precarious. It was right on the edge. So yeah, I was lucky enough to become involved in this project in 2000, straight out of my master's. And so, and go out to this island and work with an incredibly passionate and skilled group of conservation biologists. And yeah, it was a fantastic start to my career, working with birds of prey and learning about conservation, all the different interventions that you can do for crisis management in these kind of situations. So it's very exciting as a young guy to be out running around the hills of Mauritius, abseiling down cliffs, pulling chicks out to band them, as we're doing here in the photo, so that we could do population estimates and keep track of the birds and learn more about their ecology.
That's a bird that got down to an incredibly small number of individuals. How many were left at the lowest point?
I think the estimates are around 3. So 1 female, 2 males. That's in the wild. And then I think there was an individual in captivity. And they nearly lost it. We nearly lost it.
That's incredible. And, I think most people at that point would give up. When there's 3 left of a species, you'd say, okay, that's doomed to extinction. There's nothing we can do. You mentioned Carl Jones, and it sounds like he was a bit of a mentor. So I guess, he had a different approach to conservation to what others, what was popular at the time. Now, I'll just interrupt here. I notice we've had a lot more people join. So welcome again to AWC in Conversation. If you want to ask questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom. And if you have tech problems, hopefully you won't need to, but you can use the chat button at the bottom there. So Rich, we've just been talking about your background and that first project in Mauritius that you were involved with the Mauritius Kestrel. And a mentor of yours, Carl Jones, was a bit of an inspiration. So I guess it was a really hands-on approach that was quite different. And that actually turned around the fate of that species, didn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. and it's, you know, very much in the line of the Californian condor and other species around the world that got down to ridiculously low numbers around that time. He was one of the driving forces, and he instigated a captive breeding program. So he is one of the big proponents of I get not invasive, but interventionist conservation, which sort of takes the approach of very intensive management. So both predators, well, managing the threats, but also managing the species, for example, by taking eggs into captivity, breeding them, then learning how to release them back into the wild. And it's been hugely successful. When I left the project, we estimated the population at around 700 or 800 individuals. And other species like the echo parakeet that went down to 9 individuals, I think it was, and the pink pigeon that went down to 13 individuals, you know, they were all back up in their hundreds. And recently the echo parakeet's been taken off the critically endangered list down to vulnerable, I think it is actually, which is just, was unfathomable, you know, unimaginable, I should say, 20, 30 years ago. It's just incredible, an incredible story.
I think that's it's really inspiring to hear of those success stories from animals that got so rare. And you know, there are similarities with AWC's approach. You know, our mission is effective conservation of all Australian wildlife and their habitats. But to do that, it's really the model of conservation that defines our work. So we take a hands-on approach. Most of our staff are based in the field, and we're out there, you know, carrying out interventions to improve the fate of species which are right on the brink. So there are some parallels there, I think, with that work that you did in the Indian Ocean and Mauritius. All right, so from there, you spent a bit of time in Madagascar with the fishing eagle, and then a move to New Zealand, where there's another endemic raptor. Do you want to talk a little bit about that project and that bird?
Yeah, that's right. I was lucky enough to move there in about 2002. That's me popping a transmitter on a bird to track its movements and look at its ecology. And I was lucky enough to meet a group of people, Debbie Stewart and Noel Hyde, who very similar to Carl Jones, very hands-on conservation biologists, and they run Wingspan Birds of Prey Trust. And I really realised that there wasn't a lot of ecological research that had been done about this species. There's a lot of descriptive stuff. We didn't really have a good handle on their requirements out in the real world. So I undertook to do my PhD on New Zealand Falcons, and then ended up working on them in various different capacities, but for Wingspan Birds of Prey Trust particularly.
And you know, you've got your hands on that falcon there, but these are, you know, they're fairly serious predators with very sharp claws. I think I should do a graphic content warning for this next photo, but can you talk about some of the challenges of working with this sort of vicious animal, which are descendants of dinosaurs, let's not forget?
Oh yeah, they've got some pretty sharp apparatus on them. Obviously, they need to dispatch their prey pretty quickly. I should say this is an endemic raptor that only occurs in New Zealand, the Karearea New Zealand falcon. It's a threatened species in decline, but it's a bird hunter, and as a bird hunter, yeah, they're pretty feisty little things. And where I was studying them, which was actually not in their native habitat, it was in plantation pine forests, they were nesting on the ground. And they, being a New Zealand species, they've grown up without any natural predators, so they're just not bothered by humans at all. They're not shy of them, and they defend their nests vigorously. And basically, you walk in to go and find out what's happening, trying to, you know, get an idea of the numbers of eggs, the reason the nest might be failing, how many chicks have hatched, etc. They like to bash you around the head, and that's the result of a New Zealand falcon attacking me, going in to find out what was happening with their nest. Yeah.
Intense birds. So finally, you ended up in Australia, and I just want to talk a little bit about your role with AWC. So since 2017, you've been the regional ecologist in the Northeast, and that means you were responsible for our science program across almost a dozen different sites. So that's very different working at a continental scale than working on small islands. It must have been a bit of a change from those small island projects that you'd worked on previously.
Yeah, phenomenally exciting. Yeah, I mean, I've always considered myself a naturalist, an ecologist. Yeah, I've got a particular passion for birds and for, birds of prey we've talked about. But I've just been a geeky wildlife person my whole life, and running around in the bush. And so to get the opportunity to come over here and work in all these fantastically different environments with all these amazingly skilled people that have work in the northeast, both land managers and ecologists, the opportunity to learn from these folk working in these incredible areas has just been, life's dream, really.
Fantastic. I've just pulled up the map showing all of those different sanctuaries. So incredible diversity from Bullo River over in Victoria River District of the Northern Territory through the top end, Pungalina, which is on the Gulf of Carpentaria, Picatinny Plains and Brooklyn in North Queensland. So sort of tropical savannas bordering on wet tropics rainforest. Mount Zero Taravale, which is that fantastic spectrum from sort of wet tropics rainforest right through into drier arid zones type vegetation. And then down in southern Queensland, Curramore, in the Gold Coast hinterland, and Bowra, which is quite an arid area. So a huge range of different sanctuaries. Do you want to just talk through the main components of the science program in the Northeast? So, what are we trying to achieve through the science program up there?
Well, as we talk about a lot in AWC, we run a science-informed land management program. So a large part of the Northeast team's day-to-day is running our eco-health monitoring program, which involves us keeping track of the trends of key indicators of biodiversity on all of our sanctuaries. And that, as you can imagine, the size of some of these sanctuaries and the number and scales that we're working on takes a lot of effort, a lot of resources. And that's really about us making sure that we are managing things appropriately, and that overall things are improving on our sanctuaries. A lot of the problems that we have with the conservation world is not really knowing whether we're having a benefit or not. And AWC has really taken on that challenge to try and absolutely unequivocally illustrate, yes, our management is benefiting these sanctuaries. So our ecologists spend a lot of work, a lot of their time running around on these sanctuaries, trying to collect the data, collecting the data, not trying, to illustrate which way things are happening, and if things aren't going in the right trajectory, how we might go about changing that. And then also facilitating and undertaking targeted research to try and fill some of the knowledge gaps that we might need to manage some key values in a more efficient or better way.
Great. And that brings us to some of the research that you've been involved in recently. So you've been able to continue pursuing birds of prey through strategic research. This recent project is focused on a very rare bird of prey called the Red Goshawk. Can you remember the first time you heard about the Red Goshawk and what your reaction was?
Yeah, I remember it vividly, actually. It was right back in 2002 when I first moved to New Zealand. Went to a cafe. I sat down with a guy, a fellow birder, who'd just come back from Queensland on holiday. Well, actually, I think he does some work over there. A guy called Ray Pearce, who lives up on the Tablelands now, and we were talking, and he learned that I was quite into birds, and particularly birds of prey. And he leans over the table and says, "Oh, I've seen a red goshawk, Rich. I saw my first one. I've just seen it. You'll be impressed." And I remember thinking, "Oh yeah, that sounds amazing. No idea what that bird is. That sounds amazing though." But went back home, pulled out my my field guides and my raptor books and started reading about this bird and started realizing, wow, yeah, okay, this is why this guy was excited. It's a tropical raptor that with basically wedge-tailed eagle's feet on a brown goshawk that over 50% of its diet is parrots. You know, this thing is mean, and it lives in the tropical forests of Australia. You know, it sounded like a pretty exciting bird to me. So, yeah, I always remember that. And I remember sitting back thinking, yeah, if I get the opportunity to move to Australia, see what we can do about working with that species.
Stunning looking birds, really striking. Is it easy to see them?
No, phenomenally difficult. And having worked with some of these birds, a lot of rare birds around the world, you know, it's often the case. They're naturally living at low densities. They're threatened species. There's not a lot of them, you know, but Red Goshawk, man, they're another level of challenge. They are highly cryptic. They really are in very low numbers now. And they live in these habitats that are vast and incredibly difficult to survey. They're known as, you know, they're renowned amongst bird watchers, in fact, to be, you know, one of those lifer birds that people very rarely get the opportunity to see.
I've just got the distribution map up on the screen now and the habitat. So can you describe what role they play ecologically? So they're predators, but how do they hunt, and how do they, you know, what are the requirements for their habitat for them to be able to hunt effectively?
So they're a top order predator. They're at the top of the food chain. They eat mostly birds. And like I just said, over 50% of their diet appears to be, I say that there's still a lot we need to learn about these birds, but appears to be parrots. I've seen them chasing palm cockatoos, for example. It's a pretty impressive thing to try and take down, considering the big snitch they've got on them. And they spend a lot of their time hunting underneath the canopy. So our thinking is that they require quite an open forest habitat type. The photo here is a Darwin stringy bark forest, Eucalyptus tetradonta, which is very common across the top end, particularly Cape York, and in the NT. And that is a habitat that is burnt relatively frequently, and that means it keeps the understory very open. So, you know, the research that I'm involved in, that I started, and University of Queensland student Chris McColl has taken on, is really aimed at trying to understand this. But we think that they really like these tall forests that enables them to hunt species underneath the canopy.
Right. You mentioned fire briefly there. So, you know, AWC talks a lot about the fire management that we do, especially across Northern Australia. How does that help maintain that habitat structure?
Yeah, well, these birds used to range all the way from Sydney up through into Cape York across the top end. And although they're always at low numbers, it seems, you know, that they had quite a large distribution. And that distribution has retracted now, as far as we know, to the point where we don't have any active breeding nests, south of Cape York. So they seem to have withdrawn from the entire east coast of Australia now. And a lot of that, not just habitat clearance, but habitat degradation. And I think that's the loss of traditional fire regimes. So habitat thickening seems to have had a large impact on these species and reduced their ability to hunt in those areas as I just described.
Fantastic. Now, I'll just remind everyone that we've got lots and lots of questions streaming in. Feel free to add your question too by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to address as many as we can, but it seems like we won't get to all of them because there's literally dozens and dozens of questions rolling in. We'll come to those shortly. Rich, do you want to just tell us about the current project and some of the methods you're using to find out more about this incredibly elusive bird?
Yeah, so I started this research back in 2013, really. I guess started to look at the distribution of red goshawks in southeast Queensland, and really, well, that was a limited research project because we found there weren't any here anymore. And then I went and worked for Queensland Government, and with David Stewart at Queensland Government, we started the Red Goshawk Recovery Team. started talking to the experts in the field, looking at the recovery plan and looking at actions that we might be able to promote to learn more about the species to improve our ability to manage them. So coming over to AWC, that research has continued. We have several sanctuaries across their range that have suitable habitat and birds nesting, we hope, including Piccadilly Plains, Wongalara, and Mornington, Marion Downs. Most recently, university student Chris McCall has started taken on this research as part of his PhD with the University of Queensland. And we've been catching birds and putting GPS satellite transmitters on them. And that's important because these birds are thought to have vast home ranges. And we really don't have a good handle on where they're going, what they're doing, and why they're doing it at the moment. So the idea is to put these transmitters onto birds so that we can get a better handle on what their requirements are in the environment and what we can do to improve things to manage conditions for them better.
So the tracking of a bird like this sounds kind of complicated, but can you just describe what's going on in this photo?
Yeah, so we're attaching, like I say, GPS satellite transmitter to the bird in this photo. It's a tiny little unit, about 8 grams. It's got a solar panel on the back of it that you can just see on the top. And we actually fit them with a harness. It's a Teflon harness, so it's really soft and smooth, so it doesn't abrade the bird at all. And we put that under the wings around the neck and preen it into the feathers, so it fits them quite nicely. It doesn't affect their ability to hunt, doesn't affect their aerodynamics at all. And you can see on this photo here that the transmitter just sort of disappears into the body feathers, and this is the aerial sticking out of the back. So we get 6 fixes a day that it's a GPS location, so it's down to 2 meters accuracy. Gets sent back via the satellite system to our computers so we can track these birds over a number of years.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we're just about up to time, so we might go to some questions. We've had a number of people asking about problems of genetic diversity. So I know that's, you know, a particular problem when populations get very small. Do you think red goshawks are at that point where genetic inbreeding is an issue?
I'm not sure we're quite at that stage. We don't have a good handle on the population size at the moment, but we're certainly not down in the realms of the Mauritius kestrel or Californian condor that have gone down to single digits. But generally, it's thought that if a population declines very quickly and then you're able to increase that population by whatever means equally rapidly, then you can retain a lot of the genetic diversity in that species. So it really depends on the time over which the declines and then the subsequent increase back up to healthy population sizes occur over. But the red goshawk, it's still early days, and they're certainly in decline, and we don't fully understand that decline, but I'm not sure they're quite at that stage yet.
Okay, that's good news. It's just ticked over to 12 o'clock. So I just, if anyone does have to duck off, I think the question on everyone's lips will be, how can I help? So please go to our website, australianwildlife.org. You'll see a link to our current campaign, and you can choose which of our projects you'd like to support. So you can donate online there, or you can call us over the phone, and the phone number is also listed on our website. So that's australianwildlife.org. One example of one of the projects you can choose to help fund is fire management across Northern Australia. So you might choose to support burning across 300 hectares of fire management, or you might like to sponsor a translocation. So they're all options on the donation page of our website. All right, another question here, just about actually catching these birds. How do you do that safely? It seems like an incredible challenge.
Yeah, it takes a lot of effort and involves me and others hiding under logs, being eaten by green ants and mosquitoes very early in the morning in the dark, waiting to catch them. But they, you know, as a friend of mine likes to say, birds of prey don't eat peanut butter sandwiches. So we use lures to bring the birds down and catch them in nets on the ground. And then it's a matter of very carefully retrieving that bird and making sure those talons are well secured.
Right. Okay. And then handling them, I guess it's just keeping the head covered. Is that right? While you're fitting the harness with the GPS tracker?
Yeah, well, the red goshawk, you know, largely uses its feet to tackle its prey. So, you know, once you've got those feet secure, then in terms of safety to us, they're relatively calm in the hand, actually. But to make sure the bird is as calm as possible, yeah, we use a falconry hood, which is like blinkers on a horse, that gets popped over the head, and that keeps the bird nice and calm while we're processing it and putting the transmitter on.
Fantastic. All right. Another question here about how they compete with other birds of prey. So is that well defined? Do we know how their niche differs from birds of prey which cohabit with them?
Yeah, well, they do. You know, other birds of prey will rob the nests, like black-breasted buzzards are a bit of a problem for them. But by and large, there aren't no other birds of prey will take parrots of the size that they will take. And also, I would argue, do not have the power and agility of these things. I've watched male red goshawks chase down a rainbow lorikeet from a standing start and catch them. And that's, you know, as a raptor guy, that blows my mind that a bird of this size can move that quickly under the canopy after such a maneuverable little spitfire of a bird, you know. But also, like I say, I've seen them chasing palm cockatoos, which are a huge, mean parrot. Yeah, they're beautiful, but yeah, I wouldn't want to put my finger near one of those bills. And yeah, we found remains of sulfur-crested cockatoos under the nest. So yeah, there's not many birds of prey are that confident to go after prey like that. So they are quite unique.
Fantastic. Do they use the same nest year after year? There's another question that's come in. So what's their breeding range like?
Well, their current range is really through cyclone country. So a lot of the time the nests actually get blown out of the trees in the intervening years. But yes, if there's a nest there, a nest remains, they can use it for multiple years in a row if it doesn't get blown out of the tree. But yeah, it's not uncommon for them not to nest in exactly the same spot every year.
Okay, and we've recorded them on a number of AWC sanctuaries. Do you know which ones we've seen red goshawks on?
Yeah, Piccaninny Plains. We think they're probably across most of our northern sanctuaries, but Piccaninny Plains, we've certainly recorded them breeding there, and we know they occur there now. And also Mornington, Murray and Downs. And we're thinking highly likely that they are present and breeding on partnership sites, Dumbi Mangari, Willingen, and Yampi as well, which is very exciting, and we're hoping we can look into some of those birds over there as well in the future.
Great. Now, you've got an article about this work in the latest edition of our magazine, Wildlife Matters. For people who subscribe to the print version, that should be in your mailbox shortly. If not, it's on its way. But you can also access this online, and we can share a link to the Wildlife Matters page in the chat on Zoom. All right. Well, I think we've got time for a few more questions, so keep them coming in. And thank you for everyone who has joined this week. This has been a record turnout. A question here about the breeding again. So do they mate for life? Is it a pairing that lasts over the years?
No, I mean, we don't have any data to say either way, to be really honest. But in my experience, that is a very rare thing to happen. For example, monitoring that I've done on New Zealand Falcons, where we managed to band nearly all of the birds in the forest over multiple years. Pairs that were breeding in the same spot, and that if you hadn't got colour bands on these birds, you wouldn't have been able to know who was who, but you would have just presumed that is the same pair. No, they were swapping and changing all over the place. So yeah, it's a nice idea, but I think it's highly unlikely. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And a few people now asking about the results of some of that tracking. And I know that this is an ongoing project, so we can't share all of that data, but there's been some pretty remarkable movements of the birds that you've tracked.
Yeah, they really have. I mean, we're only in the early stages because it took a long time to learn how to catch these birds and to make sure that everything was being done very carefully. It's a very special, rare bird. We didn't want to rush anything and make sure that we were doing everything as sensitively as we could. So we're in very early days, but preliminary results are showing that the adults and the juveniles alike are moving hundreds of k's away from their nests and their breeding territories, which is totally unexpected. Yeah, so Chris McCall is currently analysing that data, and a lot of us sitting around waiting eagerly to hear the details of the results. So it's exciting times.
Yeah, really great. A question that's come in not just today, but over a couple of the webinars has been, if you could travel back and put yourselves in the shoes of a young scientist or someone studying conservation today, would you have any advice for them? How do you, if you're interested in this sort of career, what's the best step to get involved?
Good question. Volunteering, I would say. I spent a lot of my career, a lot of my time as a kid, as a teenager, at university, volunteering for different organisations, getting to know people, and just spending time out and making yourself available and not giving up, really. Yeah, it's certainly not a career to get in for financial rewards, but the rewards you get from working in these places and with other people with similar passions, wouldn't change it for the world. Fantastic. Volunteering, though, absolutely.
A question here, which is what I should have asked earlier, actually, but how do you best identify a red goshawk in the field? And I'm going to take this opportunity to share your book, Richard, The Field Guide to Australian Birds of Prey in Flight.
Shameless promotion. I like it. Well, this is one of the really big problems we have, is unless they're perched, when they're perched, they're actually very distinctive red, mean-looking raptor, with huge yellow feet, and they're very obvious. But in flight, they're actually quite a challenging bird to identify. So myself, Matt Gilfedder, and Stephen Debus, who is one of Australia's most well-known and knowledgeable raptor biologists, got together to make an ID guide to actually describe although the ID guide was aimed at improving everyone's ability to identify different birds around the country, my real focus was on, well, how do we get better sightings of red goshawks coming through, because it's, they live so far, there's so few and far between, that we really do need the public's help in identifying where these birds are. We can't be, that you could never have a team large enough to find all of the birds. So the book that we published is the best place to go and look. In terms of specifics, it really is about relative size and shape of this bird. They're a tricky bird to distinguish from, say, a square-tailed kite or a swamp harrier or something like that. So I'd suggest getting hold of that field guide.
Good, nice one. So
and all proceeds go to the BirdLife Raptor group. So it's another donation to another good cause.
Guilt-free promotion. I like it. Okay, we'll wrap up shortly. I think just a couple of other questions. So this work is a partnership as well. Do you want to just name the other partners involved in supporting this work?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of different people and organisations involved in supporting this research, and with it spreading over such a large area, that's absolutely necessary. But we're directly working in partnership with the Queensland government, particularly the Threatened Species Unit there. Rio Tinto have been a very big supporter of this project right from the start. and the University of Queensland have also come on board recently, most notably with Chris starting his research.
Great. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. For
Thanks,
anyone
Jim.
who didn't get their question answered, we'll try and fill you in, but you'll understand that we had an overwhelming number of questions to get to as well. So thank you very much for attending and for all of your engagement. Again, if you're inspired by this work that we're doing and you'd like to make a donation to AWC, you can do that on our website, australianwildlife.org. I hope you'll join me again next week. My guest will be AWC's Chief Scientist, Dr. John Konofsky, and he'll be joined by our National Science Manager, Liana Joseph. So we'll be talking about AWC's science program nationally, and in particular about our contribution to the new Threatened Species Index, a way of tracking how things are going with threatened species populations. This conversation has been recorded, so we'll send a recording before the weekend in the next couple of days. And please do share it with your friends or anyone who you think would be interested. Word of mouth is just as valuable as donations in some cases. So spread the good word. We've got a link in the chat to register for next week's, and also to our website where you can donate or read more about this project in Wildlife Matters. Rich, thanks again.
Thanks, Joey. Thanks, everyone.
Everyone else, I'll see you next week. Thank you.